My name's David Burke. I'm 60 years old. I was born in 1961 in Brisbane. And went to school there for a while. Moved around a little bit. Spent a bit of time in Bundaberg with my father. Got a job up in there when I was about 10 or 11. But then came back and I went to high school in Brisbane. I had a happy but a little bit disjointed childhood. My mother was divorced a number of times, and it left me. I went to a couple of schools. Ended up going to Brisbane Grammar School in year 11 and 12. I got to the end of that time and really didn't know what I wanted to do. Was playing a bit of rugby. Uni was free at the time, so I kept playing rugby and enjoying that, and ended up doing a science degree, did a bit of teaching, and worked in pubs at night as a bouncer, making money to put myself through study and keep myself going. And so I had a really interesting time from sort of school and through uni, and just kept tracking along. I wasn't really sure where I was going, what I was doing, and then it all came together when I was about 26 or 27, because I'd always had an interest in the military. I'd had an interest in flying, and I was kind of looking at where I was going to go with my life. And I opened up the newspaper, and there was an ad that said, "Become an army pilot, no experience required." So I thought, well, that sounds like everything I want to do. So I joined. I put an application in. I was invited to come and do some testing, and I did the testing and then was selected to go in front of the board. And the first question that they asked me was, "What's your experience? You don't seem to have an experience." And then after that I started to understand the military, because the first thing it said on the ad was no experience required. So I came back and said to my wife at the time, I guess that's one of the other things, I was very blessed that when I was at school, when I was only 16, I met a delightful young lady at a party, and we started talking, and we didn't realise that here we would be sort of 44 years later, still together, and she's always been a great support through everything I did. And I came home to Linda and said, well, it looks really interesting, I'd really like to join the army. It says you don't have to have any experience, so I have to have some experience. So I decided to learn to fly, and I was a school teacher at the time. Didn't have a lot of money, and Linda was a nurse, so we ended up living in my mother's garage and put all our money into flying lessons. And I did a private pilot's license, and then reapplied and came back and said, well, I'm back and now I have some experience. And based on that, they accepted me. So I started and went in, and it was an interesting experience. I went to Point Cook to go through flying course, and I came in as an officer cadet. So it was basically go through pilot's course, and I think the pass rate was usually about a third. It was a pretty tough course, a lot of stress, and if you didn't pass, then that was the end of my military career. I'd just go off and do something else. I thought, well, nothing ventured, nothing gained, nothing lost. So I decided to do that, and went off, and was one other guy, a good mate of mine. Both of us were at the upper age, 27. Everyone else was quite younger. So it was an interesting experience going through, when some of the instructors were a little younger than we were, so we had a little bit more maturity, a little bit more life experience. But we dragged our way through, and I passed, and I ended up going off to fly Black Hawks. But I guess I can sort of take a step back from that, because one of the motivations I remember, just before, when I was trying to decide what to do, in those days they had a sky show in Brisbane. It was called the FM 104 Sky Show, and they had a Black Hawk flying and doing an air display when they were brand new. It was the very first one. and we were sitting on a boat having a few beers with some mates, and I saw this incredible machine, and I just said to my mates, that's what I'm going to do, I'm going to fly Black Hawks. And they just laughed at me and said, have another beer. And anyway, 2 years later, that aircraft was number 104, which is why they'd used it in that sky show. It was the same as the radio station. And 2 years later, I got to strap in and fly 104, and that was a pretty special time in my life. And I rang up some of my mates and had a bit of a laugh about it, and away we went. And so that was a really, really interesting and an enjoyable time in my life. It was late 80s, early 90s. At that stage, we had 2 very young children. We just did a lot of flying, did a lot of work, and I just remember it being just a really, really rewarding and enjoyable time in life, learning about being in the military, doing a lot of flying and working hard. And then soon after, I ended up going off an instructor's course, because at the time Army aviation was expanding very rapidly, and it was short, it didn't have a lot of experience, they needed instructors. So, but probably at a very junior level experience, I ended up going instructing, and spent some time at Oakey at the school. And then I enjoyed instructing, but wanted to get back onto into the operational end, so we went back to Townsville. And we had a 6-year period back in Townsville from sort of 95 to 2000. And it was a really torrid, busy, and complicated 6 years. A lot happened in my life in those times, but certainly very fulfilling. And I ended up getting involved in the special operations capability. It was something I'd never imagined I'd be involved in. I didn't know anything about it when I joined, and it was a lot of night flying, flying with night vision goggles, a lot of training, and I ended up. We'd work long, hard hours, fly, working 12 hours a day, but working till 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, night flying, then deploying all over the country, involved in the counter-terrorism special operations capability. It was a really rewarding time because it was a real job. Even though it was difficult at times because I was away from my family so much, it was very demanding and high pressure, but I found it to be incredibly rewarding because I felt like I was doing something important and worthwhile. In '96, in June '96, I was at an exercise and ended up in a mid-air collision with another aircraft. I think has been well documented over the years. It's a high-risk environment because you have a lot of aircraft flying very close together, and the idea is to land everybody together so that you support the guys on the ground can get in and do their job. And as we were on, we had 4 aircraft in a very close formation, very tight formation. And as we're getting close to landing, I was number 2 and the lead aircraft, and we just misjudged it, which is very easy to do on night vision goggles. It's very limited field of view. It's like sitting up close to a television with about a 40-degree field of view. There's no depth perception. It's very difficult. Takes a lot of teamwork, and we misjudged it and collided. And with the obvious horrific outcome, we lost, the other aircraft lost all their blades. I had my tail cut off, and the other aircraft crashed immediately, and we spun, and I thought tumbled, and lost an engine. And as I said, I thought that we had no chance, but we just kept fighting to the end, and we were just very lucky in the end that we managed to land the aircraft upright. If you do that in a Black Hawk, it's a great aircraft. You know, there are many of us around the world who owe our lives to the Black Hawk. It's a tough battlefield helicopter, and you know, half of us, quite a few of us on board, managed to survive, and we got out. And you know, it was a scene of, you know, I look back on it, it was an absolute scene of carnage with burning aircraft, and it was a live fire exercise. So there was munitions exploding and a lot of people fighting for their lives. But I was fortunate to be one of the survivors, and that was really, I guess, a life-altering experience.
Only 2 people survived from Black Hawk 1, which exploded on impact. 9 men died instantly, including the pilot, Captain Hales, and 3 died subsequent to the crash. All 4 of the aircrew from Black Hawk 2 survived the crash, but 7 out of the 11 SAS soldiers who'd been travelling in the back perished that night.
And it's only later that I learnt why, you know, because David Burke has obviously flown to his best and landed upright.
Dave Burke, he put her on the ground, and the aircraft, she stood up the impact. If it had been any other aircraft, then I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you, by any means.
So I got out of the aircraft and just started to move towards the 12 o'clock as we're briefed. And I don't really remember a lot after that. I remember being in pain. I broke 6 ribs, but I knew I was okay.
Australia's worst peacetime military accident since the Voyager disaster. Townsville Mayor Tony Mooney says the tragedy has stunned the community.
And we'll be in shock and in mourning now for some time. It'll be difficult to get over.
In fact, it was just yesterday was the 26th anniversary, and I just had a quiet evening. I went down to the memorial to lay a wreath with a couple of mates, and I remember reflecting on it. And the interesting thing about that is, during the accident, after we collided and before we hit the ground, I knew I was going to die, and I didn't. It's not being scared you're going to die or being afraid. I just knew it, and the biggest surprise for me was that I didn't. And I remember thinking that life would never be the same, because nothing would ever bother me again, and every day would be fresh and new. It was a fresh start. But humans are pretty resilient creatures, and it didn't take long before you're just back into normal life again, which was good, and a good way to be, I suppose. And you know, it's the memorial I was at last night. There's a memorial here in Townsville, which is a pretty special place. It was the money was raised by the people of Townsville. They passed around buckets at Cowboys football games, and got the idea. And it wasn't something driven by politicians or government. It came from the heart, from the people of Townsville, and it's a place that when I go for a walk or a run around the river in the morning, sometimes I have the opportunity to drop in, and when life's getting a little bit complicated, I can just go there and reflect. And it's a good place to. It's a special place for all those reasons. But you know, it was a defining moment in my life. But it took a while to get over that. But I made a decision that I needed to get back into it. It's funny because after the crash, my brother came up to see me, and I broke quite a few ribs, and I got out of hospital about 5 or 6 days later, and I took my brother to show him the aircraft, and I opened the door and said, "You get in one side, I'll get in the other." And he said, "Would you be right to do that?" And I thought, I don't know. And I opened the door, And I thought, yeah, I can do this. And I stepped back up and got into the aircraft, and I knew from that moment I could get back to it. And all I wanted to do was get back in and start again and help rebuild the capability. It was until that time we'd been asked to do a lot with not a lot of resources, and it was, I think that the severity of the accident, people had to rethink, and we were properly funded, and we knew we were going to rebuild a capability. And so I put a lot of time into helping get that going again, and that was my life for 3 or 4 years, was getting back to that. And we ended up with a specialised capability, and that was they were again, it was a different phase, but a really worthwhile phase. A lot of hard work, a lot of time away, a lot of late nights, but we built that up. And then towards the end of that time, we ended up deploying to East Timor, and we went to East Timor, and that was kind of the start of a really busy operational period. Then career, my first 10 years had been in a peacetime environment, but we had an operational focus in the special operations counter-terrorism role. But then the whole world started to change, and then with our deployment to East Timor, that was at sort of the first operational posting, and going into an operational environment you could call a warlike environment. It's not like people would think that you're just suddenly told to go to Timor and off you go. We knew there was a lot going on, and we deployed probably 3 or 4 weeks before up into Northern Australia. And in the special operations role, we had a number of missions we were prepared for, and there were concerns about Australians and other internationals from the UN who were in a compound, and we practiced and prepared for a mission to go and have to rescue them if we needed to, because they weren't really sure how it was going to play out. But in the end, it was quite a peaceful entry, so we didn't have to do a lot of the missions that we were preparing for. And then we went, and we ended up. There were 2 parts. We ended up spending most of our time supporting special operations. So we would do a lot of long range inserts at night. There were actually 2. There was East Timor, and there's an area called the Enclave that I'm not sure a lot of people were aware of in West Timor. There was a small section of it, of East Timor, and we would have to fly out to sea at night and fly down across the ocean to come in, and we were putting in special forces patrols into there, or spending time on quick reaction force, being prepared to go and assist if we needed to. And there were a number of times where where we were shot at and people would shoot. But what really struck me when I came back was that the risks in the operational environment were really not much greater than the risks we had in training. It's interesting with the aviation world, the things we were doing. Most of the risks were the ones that we normally face day to day, and there's a little known fact that, especially in aviation operations, that in every conflict from the First World War when we started flying up until the recent Afghanistan, more aircraft are lost to accidents than they are to enemy action, and it holds true. I mean, in Afghanistan, the Americans lost more aircraft, 90% more aircraft through accidents than they did. The greatest threat we had in Afghanistan was the terrain and the weather. And I think that we lost 2 Chinooks in Afghanistan. They were both to crashes. So the thing out of East Timor for me was that there were different. You had to get the job done, and there were pressures there, and there was an increased level of risk. and certainly to the guys on the ground who were fighting, but for the job we were doing, it wasn't a lot different. In fact, what struck me is that we didn't realise just how good our skill levels were and how hard we trained. I remember one night the weather was very poor, and we were supposed to do a mission that involved the Marine Corps, who were coming off a US carrier offshore, and they wouldn't fly because the weather was too bad. And we thought that we weren't as good as other people, and we were always training harder because we didn't think we were up to the same international standard. It was a bit of a shock to find that we were actually at a standard that was above others, and that we were operating in conditions a lot tougher than anyone else would. And that was at that time. But things have changed a lot since then. We went through, but that was an interesting experience. I found, I think the whole thing, I ended up having a lot of operational experience, and the thing that I found is that different to perhaps the experience of World War II soldiers and some of those in the really big conflicts, is that we were just, even though what we were doing was very real and the dangers were very real and the risk was very real, it was just a small part of most people's lives. And they would read about it in the paper and think about it, but it was just a small commitment, and to most people it didn't really affect their daily lives. And there were lots of examples, but I remember the first time it really struck me was we got there, the communications was really difficult. We didn't, Australia wasn't well prepared for deployable operations at that time, and didn't have very good communications equipment. And at one stage, to solve that problem, they put up a Telstra mobile phone tower in the middle of Dili, which meant that we could speak with each other on the phone, but I ended up having instant access to home. And I remember coming back from a mission, and it had been quite a difficult mission and special forces mission. We'd ended up putting some troops in. It was a contested environment, a lot of pressure, and I'd come back and I was just sitting down trying to decompress and having a cup of tea, and the phone rang, and it was my wife, and she said, and she started talking to me, and she said that Robert, our son, wouldn't do his homework, and she said, she's left here on her own, I'm not there to help her, will you please speak to your son and make sure he does his homework? And it really just took me back a minute, because here I am trying to come to terms with what I've been doing, and then back at home they don't even understand where you are and what you've been doing. And people have their daily problems in their lives, and it was important to her, but it was just something I wasn't capable of dealing with at the time. And it was the first of many times that over the career I went through, when I really understood that even though we were deployed and into some pretty tough and threatening and high risk environments, but to people at home it really wasn't on their radar. So after Timor, so we came home early from the Timor deployment, because we had to do provide the special operations capability for the Sydney Olympic Games. So it was the 2000 Olympic Games. We had to come back to go and do some simulator training in the States, some new equipment, because we developed a new capability, the ship underway capability, which was it was interesting because at the Sydney Olympics they didn't have enough hotel rooms. They were bringing cruise ships into the harbour, which made a lot of sense, but they were concerned that there was a threat that maybe someone might try and bring a bomb or a weapon of mass destruction into the harbour on a ship, or do something like that. So it was decided to develop a capability to be able to seize control of a ship at sea, which is quite a complex operation. So we spent 3 or 4 years working up to that, and one of the things we had to do, we had a whole bunch of new equipment that you would fly with. For instance, head-up displays with your night vision goggles and safety equipment for all the things that you would have, because we would fly very low over water at night, and it was just ways to try and help you to do that. So we left and had to go over to simulator training and came back and then prepared for the Olympics, and then we spent about 5 to 6 months deployed down in Sydney, working up capabilities and being on standby for the Olympics, which was another great opportunity. We managed to. One of the interesting things I remember about that is that we were out at Holsworthy, and they'd set up a camp out there, and we had with the Australian SAS, some New Zealand SAS, SEAL teams, various Americans, Brits, other nationalities, special forces, and we were the aviation complex and the aviation part of that, and we little bits from all over the place, and some, as you can imagine, some highly trained, hard men the sort of stereotypes you would imagine. And I remember the warrant officer, who was the camp commandant, getting us together one night and giving us a brief. And he said the local Liverpool, there were 3 pubs in Liverpool, and he named them, and I can't remember where. It was just a suburb in Western Sydney next to where we were. And he said they form a triangle, and inside that triangle is out of bounds because it's dangerous. And I looked at who we were with. I looked around and I thought, if it's dangerous for them, there's no way in the world I'm going into that triangle. And I just looked at it, I thought, it was just one of those moments where you have a bit of a laugh when you think about it. Yeah, there must have been some hard people at those pubs. So we did that, and then went home, and then from there I was posted overseas, and I went off for something completely different and went to the United Nations Truce Supervision Organisation, UNSO, which is the original peacekeeping mission between Israel and the surrounding Arab countries. So I went for a year and a half, and went to, the family came with us at that time. It was quite benign, the environment, and the family came, and we went to Jerusalem for some training, and then after about a week or two, we were posted to Damascus in Syria, which was absolutely fascinating. So we drove down through Jordan into Damascus, and I spent a lot of time working on the observation post, the OPs, up on the Golan Heights between Syria and Israel, and Linda and the kids were in Damascus, and we were there for 6 months, and then I ended up being posted across into the headquarters in Jerusalem as an operations officer there. So I went there to into Jerusalem, and it was a fascinating time, and it was, when I look back on it, it was a really challenging time, and again another life-altering experience for us and for the family, because the second Intifada began, and a lot of people, it was Intifada was if you like, an uprising of the Palestinian population in Israel, and it was a really dangerous and complex environment. A lot of suicide bombings, a lot of really dangerous and violent stuff going on. But January 2001, as I said before, it was life-changing in so many ways, because to be in that environment, and so much of the you've got to understand that conflict, to understand the Middle East, and to actually have the opportunity to live there and see it was fascinating. And for me, to be able to be part of that environment and see that, it was also the first time where I was in an international environment, both military and UN, working in that with other countries. Just a few Australian officers amongst a lot. It was just such an experience. But then it did, it started off to be pretty benign, and then once we get through, it really became quite dangerous in Israel, and firstly with the Intifada, and then while we were there was 9/11. So it was a lot of people probably are aware of 9/11, but the Intifada was happening at the same time. I think at that stage Jerusalem was a very dangerous place, and it was. I look back on it, it was crazy. The family ended up being evacuated, but we definitely left it too long to evacuate the family. And I look back, I think we call it acceptable levels of violence, or it's the frog in the boiling water. What was happening around us at the time seemed normal and acceptable, and it was far from it. And by the time we made the decisions for the families to be evacuated, when I look back on it, we should have done it much sooner. But that was just a fascinating life experience. And we left from there and came home, and I went to staff college and had various postings, and ended up going back to squadron command, flying, and then had a series, a lot, sort of from about 2003 to 2010, did a lot of different flying type jobs. I was a squadron commander, then I was the operations officer for the aviation brigade at a very busy time. At that time we ended up deploying we did employ every available squadron aircraft we had. It was quite an extraordinary time. We had aircraft in the Solomons, we had in East Timor, in Afghanistan, all over the world. There was a lot going on, and then in 2008-9, I think it was, I was the first commanding officer of the 6th Aviation Regiment, which is the Special Operations Regiment. So as I said, we built up the Special Operations capability to a stage where it became, it ended up with an own dedicated regiment. I was the first CO. So during that 6 years was a very intense time of flying and operations. Ended up doing 3 short deployments to Afghanistan, taking over, setting up. Did force insertion for the Chinooks and going over and setting up the capability, monitoring it, and going backwards and forwards and commanding the regiment. And again, it was an interesting time because I spent a lot of time being heavily involved in planning and conducting operations and going backwards and forwards between theatres. And I lived for 2 years. My family stayed in Brisbane because I said the kids were at school and university, and I'd been there, and I said to Linda, there's no point coming to Sydney with me, where I went to the CO6 Regiment, because I'll just never be there. I'll be going away. It used to happen to her all the time. Sometimes I'd go to work and then not come home for 3 months, and she just didn't know where I'd gone or what had happened, and she was happy just to stay and be stable and not have to rely on me at any time for any of the help with the kids. We did that, and but I lived in the mess, and it was an interesting time because of the 42 Australians killed, a lot of them were from Special Forces, and a lot of them were from the commandos, and I lived in the commando mess. At the time, it was quite interesting. One of the guys who lived on the same floor I was with was killed, and again, what struck me was, you would be deeply involved in operations and going into these places and, you know, going to some pretty tough places, into some pretty tough environments. But for most Australians, it just didn't register. I remember I was in Afghanistan and I'd been given a job to decide who we were going to go back with, to deploy with, that we were putting the Chinooks back for a second time, and I was asked to go and fly with the Brits, the Americans, the Dutch and the Spanish, just to see who we would best suit with. And I'd been flying a mission with the Brits down the bottom of Helmand Province, and it was really very dicey, and ended up having we'd had to go into a small support base they had, and they were in heavy contact. They needed ammunition. They had some casualties and some bodies to evacuate, and we'd been working pretty hard in that day, and it was a very stressful day. And I came back and they said, look, we need your report quickly, can you come back? So instead of coming back normally through the military system, they flew me back on a just civil air, and I caught a flight out of Dubai, I think, and then to Sydney, and I was flying from Sydney back to Brisbane, and I'd literally been in a combat environment 36 hours before, I think, before getting on the plane, and I was having a gin and tonic, and the guy beside me said, Brisbane's home, is it? And I said, yes, and he said, been away on a business trip? and I just started to shake, and he kind of looked at me as if to think, this guy's got a drinking problem or something. But and it was just interesting that I found it very. It's one of the toughest things during that whole period was that, your close friends and people that were in these environments and literally in a war zone and on operations facing daily risks. But the rest of Australia were just living their normal lives and would read about it every now and then, but it just wasn't on anyone's radar. It was an interesting experience to go through. So after I got back from, after I finished up as commander of the 6th Aviation Regiment, we had 2 years at the United States Army Aviation Centre in Fort Rucker, Alabama. It was just an amazing experience, and again, it was probably the best couple of years we had. Linda and I, the fan Rob came over because it was just professional development and understanding what was going on, and I worked in an international liaison office with a whole bunch of other folks and made some lifelong friends amongst the LOs from other countries. We just happened to have a really good group. Even had a German with a sense of humour. And a whole bunch of people, and we got on really well together, and we're still friends till this day. But and it was fabulous to be there and learn what the Americans were doing, because I said earlier that in East Timor I was amazed just how our level of training was very good, and a lot of the other countries weren't up to that same sort of standard. By then, I was these guys had been at war for 8 years. And they were an amazing capability, and it was an honour to work there and work with them and learn what they were doing, and they really they were very, very professional. So it was kind of a posting away from operational tempo, but it was great because of learning a lot, helping a lot, but and it was a good break for the family, and got to experience living in the US. And I came back and was ended up the commandant of the Army Aviation Training Centre. So that was basically responsible for anyone who had anything to do with aircraft in the Army. So training pilots, aircrewmen, maintainers, rearmers, fitters, comms, which was really rewarding for 2.5 years. It was great, promotion to colonel. And then at the end of that, I had an opportunity. I saw an email, and they were looking for someone to be to go to War College in Pakistan, which is a senior course for senior officers. And and I knew I was coming towards the end of my career. And Linda had always complained that she never got to have control of her life. We just went where the army said, which was true. But I thought, well, you know what? And I had some options, and the general I was working for was a really good guy, and basically said, you know, there's an opportunity, you can come and work at the headquarters in Sydney next year at Vic Barracks if you like for this job. So I went home and I said to Linda, well, here it is. I said, we can either go to Pakistan or we can go to Sydney. Your choice. And that absolutely floored her. And it was, she just couldn't make a decision because, you know, she was just thinking about what are all the options, what do they mean. But it was kind of fun to actually give her the option to do something. And I knew she'd pick Pakistan because she just loves history and the challenge and different things. So we went to Pakistan, and I spent a year there at their National Security and War course. It was fascinating. So the first 6 months of the course were they had a lot of their diplomats and government officials and police, as well as the military, and it was about international security. And it was fabulously interesting because there were only 4 Westerners on the course, and the rest of them were from countries that you just wouldn't even consider African countries and Middle Eastern countries and South American countries, and then, you know, the second 6 months was about war fighting in that environment, the Pakistan, India, Afghanistan, and Iran. Pakistan has some interesting neighbours. I think you've got Iran, Afghanistan, China, and India, and no one gets along particularly well. So, and they had, you know, constantly all sort of 5 generations of war, from very basic insurgency and terrorism all the way through to massed armoured formations under a nuclear overhang. So professionally it was incredibly interesting. We did that course and came back for 6 months, and then I went back as the Defence Attaché, which is a diplomatic posting and military posting. And, you know, in some Defence Attaché jobs can be drinking cocktails in the embassy in Paris, but Pakistan was far from it. It was very operational, and you know, there was a lot going on at that time. Just seemed, wherever we went, it seemed to become an interesting place. And they ended up having up in the tribal areas, they had quite a serious. They just had enough of a lot of the terrorism, so they had a massive campaign. And you know, I had a very rare opportunity to sort of understand that area, and I got to stand on both sides of the Afghan-Pakistan border and look across at each with different perspectives. And I wrote a master's on Afghanistan while I was at the National Defence University in Islamabad, and got to experience life there. And it's a tough place. And, you know, one of the things after all these years is, you know, there were 2 things. Not only, I think, during my time, we're Australian, you know, the general Australians didn't really have a concept of what people were going on and doing through. What I find is coming back and hearing the commentary around, you know, what people say about ourselves and countries, that they don't understand just how lucky we are and what a great country we are and what wonderful people Australians are. If you've lived in some of these countries and seen the absolute poverty and people literally struggling to survive in so many countries and living such harsh lives, you know, I think it would change their perspective on just how lucky we are. Indeed. But then, you know, that again was an amazing opportunity to be there for 3 years, and I would regularly have contact with the senior officers. The chief of the army there ran the country, and with the prime minister, and you know, we're always looking at ways that you know, I'd accompany senior Australian visitors in DFAT. It was interesting because I would always have to do a lot with the High Commissioner because the military ran the country. So where you would normally not be involved as a military officer, you would have to be there to help open doors and create access. So you got to got to see a lot of what was going on in that part of the world. And then after 30 years, the time came to retire, and basically I jumped on a plane, left that posting to come home to retire. I think I said in one flight I went from rooster to feather duster, and it was just an incredible experience that I wasn't prepared for. You go from being right in the middle of world-changing events to getting off the plane and going home and being retired and looking out the window and watching kids go to school. So that it took a while to adjust, but the best. I had an old mate who was I'd met through sailing, who was a psychiatrist, and he gave me the best advice. And he said, "Just don't do anything for 5 or 6 months and see what you want to do. You may want to continue doing something around the military, or you may wish to be a florist. Who knows?" And I waited for a while, and we'd been living out of the country for a long. We didn't really know where home was, but we decided to come back to Townsville. We had a house here from my last posting here we'd left in 2005. It had been rented, and we came home, and to our surprise, we had an enormous coconut tree over the pool that we hadn't planted, and it was the Townsville we knew and loved. But I didn't know anyone, and that was really interesting, and I didn't know what to do. And then an opportunity came up for a job with the Council in Defence Engagement, and at the last minute I applied and got the job. And it was the best thing because now I feel like I belong, and I met people, and I feel part of the place, and you make friends, and that was good. And now I'm ready to retire again. But it's been 3 years now, but it's been an interesting journey. And I think there's a lot going on now, and people talk about the hardest part I found out of all this was that the transition was something I didn't expect to be so difficult. After 30 years in the army or in defence, and I said you just stop. But it's taken me 3 years, but for a little while there, I went down a very dark path, and it was really, really tough. And looking back on it now, I think over those years there are so many things that happen that you just have to compartmentalise, and you can't deal with it. I had so many things from the experiences around the crash I had, and operational, and the things you see overseas, and even the things you see in not just in the war fighting, but in living in places like Pakistan, and the suffering, and some of the things there. You just keep compartmentalising them and putting them away, but then you can't do that forever. And when you get out, you have to deal with them. You have to let them come to the surface, and take time to think about it and deal with it. And unfortunately, the way it has been is that you're out of your support base. You're in an unstructured environment. You just kind of leave, and then you've got to try and deal with those things. And I didn't even know I had to, but I was very fortunate that, again, I got the help I needed. And you talk to people, and it's. So it was a journey, but after about 3 years now, I'm through the other side, and I can look back now, and be proud of what I did. I think, I have happy memories of my service now, and just grateful for the incredible experiences I had. I've had an amazing life that I never thought I'd have. Had some amazing experiences, and I've been very fortunate. Everybody is different. But the important thing is speaking about it with somebody, even if it's with yourself. As I said before, I guess, when you're in the military, you're very much, the way that you are conditioned and the way that they basically bring you in, and the system changes you and the way you think, and you have to be able to operate in chaos and unpredictability, and you just, as you come up against things, you have to compartmentalize them. As I said, you have to lock them away and put them somewhere in the back of your mind. But they can't stay there forever, because that's when it really creates issues. So how do you get them out and deal with them? And talking about it, bringing them, unlocking them from the back of your mind, bringing them forward and talking about them is the way to come to be able to settle and become comfortable with your past. And for everybody, I think that's probably a little bit different. And if it's about talking to somebody or going to help troubled youth or talking to a medical professional or with your family, it doesn't really matter. It's the process of unlocking it, letting it out, and not keeping it in there, however you do it. But it's important. I think that the system is starting to understand that. But there's nothing structured. There's structured getting you in. There's structured. Your whole career is structured. They do all the things they want, and then you just leave, and that's it. And I guess that's where the issues have been. But I know that there's a lot of work going on now, looking at how we help people. And it was interesting. You look at the World War I and World War II vets. They say didn't have the same issues as the Vietnam vets to a point. But I guess the way they came home was on a ship, and then they would be able to talk with their mates, and they had time to do the things they do. But I'd had that experience where you just get off a plane and suddenly you're on your own, and you don't really have that opportunity to talk about it and get it out there and do things. So, yeah, I think there are the last thing young people want to hear is in my day stories from older people. But I think two things that strike me at the moment that have changed, and one is safetyism. There's just no risk in people's lives anymore, and we grew up, and we'd just go out the door and come back, and you do things, and I went through. I had a commitment to service and went through, and I understood that there was risk to what I was doing, and there's a little bit of risk in every day, but I knew there was risk in the job, and I was happy to do that. And I just think now, we can spend incredible amounts of money trying to take risk and out of people's lives, and you wonder whether people are better off for it when we wrap so many layers of safety and regulation around young people today, when really they just need to get out and experience life a bit and do things. And I think that it affects their resilience and the way they deal with the world. And the other one is definitely communication. It's funny because when I came back and I ended up working in an environment with young people and people who are not from a military background, it was I struggled for a while. I knew that was me because I was in an environment that was very foreign to me. But I remember sitting around and seeing a whole bunch of these kids, or young adults. They're all on their phones, and I thought, wow, what an isolated kind of way to live, But then one thing that struck me was that they all started to laugh at the same time. So there was obviously there's communication going on, but it's not the same as when I was younger. So they're communicating in this digital environment, and I've been doing a little. I've gone back and been doing a little bit of coaching with the military, with some of the aviation guys and girls, and it was. It's fascinating seeing that they're the same, and they're really good young Australians, but they do communicate in a different way. And some of the things when you're trying to create a shared mental model and an understanding of what's going on around you. I remember saying to them, you don't communicate the way. What you've got to imagine is, how do you get everybody on the same Facebook group, or how do you sort of share the same Instagram post with everybody around you when you're trying to create something if everyone isn't linked up to you? You know, the skills about just being able to sit and talk, or communicate, or draw pictures, or do things like that. It's interesting that those things just aren't there anymore. The most important thing you have in your life, and the easiest to lose, is your integrity. What I always try to do is to do the right thing, to tell the truth, and be honest with myself and others. And if you do that, you might not always be right, but you're doing what you think is right, and that's important. And people will appreciate and respect you for what you're doing. But if you don't, and the first time that you try to take advantage of someone, or you don't tell the truth, or do those things, you lose your integrity and you can never get it back. I think that, you know, that's something that's always stuck by me. That's the way I always do it. And the other thing out of my experiences is that I've learnt that there's so much out there to offer, and just go and give it a go. I mean, I'm getting towards my twilight years, but the next goal is maybe to try and sail around the world. I've got a boat. I'm now at the stage where I'm old enough to be able to afford it. I've just got to kind of keep the body in one piece to do it. But, you know, I'm just going to try and keep doing things, because if you don't keep challenging yourself and having a go and getting out of your comfort zone and looking for new horizons, well, then you may as well just sit at home and finish it, then just wither away. Yeah.